All right. Okay. All right. Welcome, everyone. Welcome everyone to the fourth meeting of the GPAC Policy and Practice Subcommittee meeting. I'm Stephanie Hardison, and I'm the Deputy Designated Federal Officer, along with the Designated Federal Officer, Mr. Boris Aratia. Boris, do you have any words?
Just welcome everybody back, and looking forward to jumping in. We have a pretty full program this afternoon, so great to see you all. That's all I got.
All right. So before we get started, we're going to take a quick roll call. And of course, we're going to start with Luke.
Here.
Rich.
Here.
Leslie.
Here.
Antonio. Mark. Mamie. Amlan.
Present.
Jenny.
Present.
Stephen. Professor Scoggin.
I'm here, and we have Anish. I don't remember if you already picked him up, but alphabetically he may be up in the front. Sorry.
I didn't get him yet. Stacy. All right. Nigel.
Present.
Anish.
Present.
David.
Present.
And Kimberly.
Present.
All right. Thank you all. So just like to mention a few things. This is a live virtual public meeting, and today's event is being recorded and will be posted to our website with all relevant meeting materials. All right. And there will be a brief section at the end of the meeting for public comments and suggestions relating to this policy and practice discussion. All right. Without further ado, I would like to go ahead and turn this over to the chairpersons.
And Boris, while we're getting started, could you just pop our agenda up for a minute there?
Sure.
Okay. So while the agenda is coming up, just a few preliminary things as we get started today. First and foremost, both Luke and I really want to thank everybody for their continued engagement. We know it's a lot and it's pretty steady, and we don't see it letting up anytime soon, but to the extent that you're engaged and contributing, thank you very much. We hope you'll stick with it. A couple other preliminary things. I'm pretty sure that everyone was there, but in our last meeting, we had a full plenary meeting. We had the full committee. And as you know, Luke and I ended up with either the privilege or the curse of speaking for the group. And if anyone feels like we overstepped in any way, by all means, please let us know. But one thing that we've gone ahead and done is keep in mind, as is always the case, the slides and of course the video from the meeting is available in the shared folder, but we've also broken out our slides for our subcommittee and posted them in our subcommittee resources file. So if you feel like you ever want to go back and refresh or take a look at that, that's available to you there as well. We have a couple relatively straightforward goals for today. And frankly, after we do some substantive discussion, I think that Luke is really going to be cracking the whip on our to-do list for today. So our primary goal is it would be wonderful if we could get agreement on our mission statement and get that behind us so that we can focus on other things. And then we're going to spend a fair amount of time continuing our prioritization of issues. And of course, we'll probably end up back with the Jamboard there. One thing I just wanted to mention very, very quickly is in the plenary sessions and in some of the subcommittee meetings, there's been a fair amount of discussion about acquisition workforce, training, and certification. And I'm about to drop into the chat a memo that, and again, I may have the date wrong, but I think this actually just cleared today. But some of the buzz that we've been hearing about, in effect, the consolidation or the harmonization of FAI with DAU seems to have accelerated rather dramatically. So some of the names you've heard from Joni Duhart to some of the others, but it feels like rather than the disaggregated workforce management rubric that we've been working with, particularly with regard to certification, that appears to be moving in a more unified fashion. So it may make it easier for us to drive training, core competencies, and fundamentals with regard to a topic. In other words, we can do it once rather than twice. But again, late breaking news, that's available to you. Okay.
Hey, Steve.
Oh, please.
Steve, hi, Rich here. Steve, this is a really big deal, and Leslie Field should be commended that the Office of Federal Procurement Policy has finally issued this out. It creates great opportunities to harmonize the federal acquisition workforce in the 1102 community, and is much needed. So this is a really good thing, in my opinion.
Right. And remember, to Rich's point, one of the things that we've been hearing over and over again is that DAU has resources in brick and mortar, and FAI is often treated as the weak sister in terms of civilian training. I think the harmonization is a win-win, but I take Rich's point, and it's an important one. Okay. In addition, while we won't spend a lot of time on this, we do want to remind you that we're continuing to seek input on speakers and topics. So looking ahead, we do indeed have a speaker for our meeting the first week of February, and that would be Porter Glock in the Office of Federal Procurement Policy. You just heard Rich Butel mention Leslie Field. Porter works with Leslie over there, but Porter has been for some time now the primary contact person in the White House, Office Management and Budget, Office of Federal Procurement Policy on pretty much everything related to sustainable procurement. So OFPP plays a very, very major role, both in terms of what goes into the federal acquisition regulation and in terms of workforce training and development. So looking forward to hearing from Porter on that, but we continue to be very, very curious to hear who else you think we should be listening to and what other topics. But what we're going to try to do today is we're going to try something a little bit different. And what we're going to do today is we're going to have a presentation and discussion facilitated by two of our subcommittee members, although I'm marginally concerned that one of them doesn't appear to be here. But Amlin Mukherjee and Stacy Smedley have agreed to have a discussion and an introduction on the issues of life cycle analysis and life cycle cost analysis. And one of the reasons that we encourage this is what we're finding in sustainable procurement, particularly outside the United States and at the state and local level, is using life cycle analysis and life cycle cost analysis is becoming a global best practice for how we try to drive the train on sustainable procurement. Now, the challenge is it means a lot of different things. But what we find in many different jurisdictions is that life cycle analysis and life cycle cost analysis helps the procurement professional, if they understand it, answer the question or respond when the boss says, I can't afford to do that. I can't afford to buy the less harmful solution. I can't afford to buy the more sustainable solution because I can't afford the price premium. What life cycle analysis and life cycle cost analysis do is they permit us to internalize our externalities, or as Kate Raworth in Donut Economics talks about the effects, particularly of climate change. And I think the reason this is so important is that for the last couple of decades in the United States and around the world, there's been a pretty robust discussion about moving away from the tyranny of low prices to value for money. But the problem is value for money is often simplified to just paying the price premium for quality versus just low price. And it's not the forward-thinking inclusion of all of the externalities that governments have to deal with. There's lots of other scenarios here, and we may later also want to talk about, as a case study, what played out with the Postal Service over the last couple of years and how these issues affected that. But against that backdrop, let me turn it over to Amlin and Stacy, who is now with us. And again, thank you so much for leading us or guiding us in this conversation.
Amlin, you're muted. There you go.
Thank you very much. Yes. And Stacy, I was just going to text you, but I'll just say it out. Feel free to, Stacy and I have worked before together. So Stacy, feel free to jump in at any time and interrupt me and add. or
Yeah, I figured you go
as
first. And if there's anything
as
I want to say, I'll interrupt you or just add on to the end.
And I'm not touching on any of the stuff that I think is like for all the building transparency stuff and EC3. I'm leaving that to you. So
Okay, great.
Wonderful. Okay, well, thank you, everybody, and thank you, Steve and Boris. I'm going to share my screen if that is possible quickly here. Let's see. I didn't even think about it. Yeah. And full screen. Are you seeing my full screen now?
Yeah.
Got it. Okay, awesome. Thank you very much. Just a quick introduction. My name is Aman Mukherjee. I'm a professor in civil environmental and geospatial engineering at Michigan Tech. And the last, going on close to 2 years now, I've been at the Office of Infrastructure at Federal Highway Administration, working with the Climate Challenge Program, as well as the pavement design and performance team. And so I'm coming to this presentation with the work that we've done. And so my biases, to put my biases out there, have been primarily in the area of infrastructure, highways and transportation, and construction materials that apply to transportation infrastructure, such as asphalt and concrete, and steel to some extent. So with that, the agenda for today, I want to start off with some fundamentals and life cycle. And Steve, that was a great, thank you for that wonderful introduction there, in terms of life cycle assessment, life cycle cost analysis. What do these terms mean? And also, where do they fit in within the broader picture of life cycle thinking? LCT, that is a term that we kind of coined a few years ago within the community, and how that is that directly pertains to the discipline of sustainability and the practice of sustainability within the context of procurement. After that, I want to go a little bit into life cycle assessment outcomes and how are we communicating that and how that is affecting procurement today. Particularly, I want to talk about product category rules and EPDs and EPD programs. And Stacy will probably pick up more on how EPDs are being used in practice in some ways. And then finally, from my time at FHW in the last couple of years, some of the initiatives that are happening within the federal government, and including how it's affecting procurement policies. Of course, again, I want to remind everybody that you'll be getting a slice of what we're doing in the world of transportation and construction materials, and to some extent, flat work as well as higher vertical for buildings as well. But the bulk of what you're looking at is construction materials, right? And so with that, I'm going to quickly jump into our first idea, which is life cycle assessment. And life cycle assessment in the idea and the practice of it actually is started in the late 1960s and was primarily driven by the idea of understanding which, if you have two alternative products, which product gives you the best outcome, and tying into the environmental impact potentials of that particular product. And the term life cycle is critical out here because as you see in this diagram, you go all the way from raw materials acquisition, materials processing, manufacturing, which brings us to what is referred to as the cradle to gate phase. So a product coming from its very cradle, including all the natural resources that go into it, flows of energy and material, to the point at which the product meets the consumer. And oftentimes the impacts associated with those phases are also referred to as the embodied carbon. And you see the term embodied carbon coming out often. And then after that, once the product goes into use and the end of life, we refer to that as the use phase as well as the end of life phase. And that takes us to cradle to grave. And what you're not seeing in this diagram is what we're increasingly talking about, which is cradle to cradle, which is once that product has been used, how does it get recycled and repurposed, and whether it's upcycling, downcycling, and there's a whole set of verbiage around that. But generally speaking, the idea of moving towards circular economy where resources once in the economy are reused and used in different ways. In this particular diagram, you're also seeing this, we have a separation between industry data and agency data, which is in the world of transportation and construction. What we find is most of our producers, for example, asphalt, concrete, steel, are private industry, but their products get procured by agencies, whether they be departments of transportation, GSA, or other government agencies, which could be at the state and municipal level as well, who buy these products, which then procure these products, which then go into our infrastructure. So just a little in terms of the science of what gets done out here is for any given particular product or process, we track the inputs and outputs, which are the flows of material and energy through this entire system. And then we use what we refer to as impact assessment methods. And the impact assessment method that's used within the United States is very standard by EPA. It's called TRACY. And we use the impact assessment method to come to midpoint indicators. And these midpoint indicators are usually environmental impact potentials. Okay, and so these environmental impact potentials, the one that's very commonly used is the global warming potential, which expresses the greenhouse gas emissions in terms of kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalents. So it's important to know the kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalents because we're not just expressing carbon dioxide, but also other greenhouse gases such as sulfur oxides, nitrogen oxides, methane, and then and actually quite a few other hydrocarbons, which then all get converted through the impact assessment method into a number that is a compact number, which is referred to as the kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalent. So when we talk about GWP, which is often turning into the commonly measured parameter that is used for our procurement discussions, we're talking about the global warming potential in terms of carbon dioxide. It is also important to note that the number out here is an potential environmental impact. So, or an environmental impact potential, which is like it gives you the potential of that particular product to on the phenomena of global warming in this particular case. There are other impact indicators as well, such as eutrophication potential, which again is the potential to result in eutrophication. And so right now, even though we mostly talk about global warming potential, we are actually also measuring and estimating and reporting all those other potentials as well. So this is your life cycle assessment. Again, we're looking at environmental impact potentials, and that's important. The next thing is life cycle cost analysis. And I'll be coming back to each of these. This is a high level introduction at this point. Now, the life cycle cost analysis in the world of infrastructure has been, we've been using this method since it was mandated by the Transportation Equity Act for the 21st century in 1998, right? Since then, we've had a guideline that was developed and published by FHWA 1999-2000, and it has been used primarily to identify the best investment option between alternative designs or alternative payment designs and approaches. Right now, life cycle cost analysis is used at the payment design stage by a lot of DOTs in different ways. If it is required for all projects that require value engineering, and then I have that 23 CFR 627, and so that is pretty much all national highway system projects that are over $50 million and has federal monies involved in there. Some states use them in alternative bidding situations as well. So, for example, Michigan DOT does use life cycle cost analysis as a way. So when they have two alternative designs, and it could be one asphalt design and one concrete design, and they put it out, the project out to bid, and then the bids come in with the net present value for the alternative design, and the lowest net present value typically wins the bid. Of course, and then what do we mean by net present value? And so if you look at this diagram, what we're seeing is we start off with an initial cost, and then we look at maintenance costs over a particular period of time. And so in this case, if you were to just keep it simple and go to 5 years, let's say for the sake of argument, typically these periods are 30 to 40 years for highway infrastructure. But what you do is you take all of these expected maintenance costs over time, and then bring them for a given interest rate, you discount them back to their present day value and add that to the initial cost to come up with a net present value for these alternative designs. And so this is, so the underlying methodology is based in engineering economics, very fundamental way of calculating net present value. But of course, what that means is that we also have to develop models of understanding what that analysis period is, what the right interest rate selection is, and also understanding like what are the, so of course I've put in these T=1, T=2, I put in these maintenance. So but what is a typical maintenance cycle? How many years do you have between initial construction and the first maintenance, followed by second maintenance and rehabilitation? What are those typical service life intervals? And estimating those, again, depends on understanding payment performance. Broadly speaking, what this brings us is that life cycle cost analysis and life cycle assessment are really, they all become part of the broader assessment of sustainability for our infrastructure, which if you think back to the definition of sustainability as being the triple bottom line, using the triple bottom line, understanding the social aspects, the economic aspects, and the environmental aspects. So your life cycle cost analysis falls right within the economic assessment of the infrastructure. Life cycle assessment and EPDs, and I'll be shortly talking about EPDs, fall under your environmental assessment. And then the direction that we're moving in right now is moving more towards understanding the social aspects of the social impacts of our infrastructure, and this like social life cycle assessment and sustainability rating with Invest is a FHWA platform. And so so far, the most work that we've done falls right here again within the economic and environmental areas, and I'll be talking primarily about what's happening with EPDs. Life cycle cost analysis, as I pointed out, is already a fairly standard part of procurement practice right now. And of course, there is no standard approach across the country, but again, wherever there are federal dollars involved, whenever value engineering for projects over $50 million is involved, that's where LCCAs are required. States use it differently. And as I pointed out in the case of Michigan, LCCA is often used in alternative bidding scenarios. But broadly speaking, life cycle cost analysis and looking at net present value of alternative designs for infrastructure is pretty much part of standard practice and has been for easily for the last 15 years or more. So then the question next is, well, how do we communicate if we go back to the life cycle assessment part, which is new to us and we're working with right now, how do we communicate life cycle assessment outcomes? As I was pointing out, if you're doing an assessment of inventories based on inputs and output flows of material and energy, this could very easily become something that could be chaotic and open to different methods, right? So, and that's how we started about 15, 16 years ago, when we had different industries saying, oh, look, our products are greener than our other products, and or typically our competitors' products. And so what has happened in the last 10 to 12 years is there has been a movement towards standardization within these industries. And so the two main industries that I've worked with typically, particularly with construction materials, is asphalt and concrete, and both have developed over time their EPD programs. And so what does that mean, right? So first and foremost, industries have developed their product category rules. And so what does the product category rule do? It basically ensures that for a particular product category, so within a specific industry, how do you first and foremost establish the goal and scope of the life cycle assessment that gets done and how it gets reported? So the goal and scope is like, well, why are we doing the life cycle assessment, right? And that in this particular case, where we are right now with our cradle to gate, much of our life cycle assessment we're doing is cradle to gate, where we're getting the embodied carbon through the life cycle assessment, is and that is a scope that has been decided across the industry, and that's pretty much where, if you were to look for outcomes for asphalt material or a concrete material, a concrete mixture, an asphalt mixture, that's the goal that you would get that is adhered to across EPD programs. The next is the scope. Well, when we say we're going to take everything all the way from cradle to gate, the next question comes in, well, your interpretation of everything and my interpretation of everything may be a little different. And so this is where the product category rules are very useful, because the product category rules are developed by a product category rule committee. And the committee usually involves industry stakeholders, agencies, government typically people from organizations such as FHWA, state DOTs, so the users of the product, so that there is a common consensus on what those system boundaries are, what is and what is not accounted for. And so that every time somebody does an LCA to produce an EPD, there is clear consensus on what has been accounted for. And we avoid double counting in this way. And we also make sure that the most critical and important things are accounted for. While other things like, for example, when we're looking at the plant that goes into the development of in the manufacturing of the concrete mix or the asphalt mix, we have consensus that we're not accounting for the impacts of the construction of that plant itself. And part of it is because, the consensus was that those impacts are not directly relevant to the manufacture of the product itself. So these conversations have happened over 5 to 7 years through 2010, 16, 17, and both asphalt, concrete, steel, they have fairly mature PCRs at this point. The other thing also is that when you're doing this kind of an analysis, there is also question of how the data has been collected and what data has been collected. And so PCRs also go into the discussion of putting out guidelines for data collection and the time horizons for reporting, and also ensuring that some of our data is that these outcomes are reported with appropriate geographical regionalization, right? So the next thing I want to talk briefly about is the background data, because as you can see in this corner out here of my screen, I talk about fuels, electricity, and transportation. These are upstream effects that all LCAs have to account for. For example, anything that uses fossil fuels, where are we getting the data for our fossil fuels? And when we talk about fossil fuel impacts, we're talking about all the way from the crude oil being extracted to it being refined to it being combusted in your particular process. And so over the last 5 to 7 years, we've had a fair amount of work through the Federal Highways Sustainable Pavements Working Group, where we've worked with the Federal LCA Commons, which is a group of federal representatives from different federal agencies that collect life cycle assessment data through the reported through the federal government. And over time we have, and these data sets are open and available and they're free to use. And so over time we've developed a repository for fuels, electricity, and transportation that can be used. These inventories can be used and they're available within the Federal LCA Commons repositories. One important thing is our PCRs have taken to recommending the use of these background data sets. This makes a big difference because now we know that when we are looking at the LCA outcomes reported for 2 different products, they're using the same upstream data sets. And this is very important because when the upstream data sets or the background data are not the same, we can see differences in the outcomes of that. So there has been some standardization in that area. So once all this LCA is done, the PCRs, product category rules are written. The LCA is then done based on the product category rule, and the outcomes are reported according to the same product category rule protocols. And what we have is the EPD, the Environmental Product Declaration, right? So it's a standardized instrument of LCA outcomes, and it's reported using these standards. And so I did not mention in my last slide out here, I want to highlight, you will often see all of these processes are governed by the ISO 14025 as well as ISO 21930. And these processes are given to third-party reviews, third-party independent reviews, and these reviews are open. So at any given time for a given PCR, you can go back and see what the reviewers said, who the reviewers were, and how the review comments were resolved by the PCR committee. So there is a fairly rigid and transparent review process in there that allows for this process to be transparent and meet the needs of actually disclosing all this information in a transparent and a standardized process. So this is out here, you're seeing this is a typical impact summary table for, and this is for an asphalt mixture per, if you see out here, it's per US ton of asphalt mixture. So the unit in this case is a declared unit. And what you're seeing is that your global warming potential is about 67.09 kilograms of carbon dioxide per ton of asphalt mixture. And then now, of course, you can look at this and say, really, 0.09, you really need that 0.09. And so oftentimes the answer is yes, we do, because typically one doesn't buy 1 ton of asphalt mixture on a project. You're buying buying to the order of hundreds or thousands of tons. And so that is why sometimes if you're wondering why we have those decimal places, it's usually caters to the order of magnitude in which the product is purchased on typical projects. And as I mentioned, you also have the other categories that are typically reported, which is ozone depletion potential, eutrophication potential, acidification potential, as well as POCP, which we also refer to as smog potential. Broadly speaking, what you have are these programs. You start off with the product category rule, setting up specific rules. A life cycle assessment has to be conducted for the material because it shows that the product category rules can be actually implemented. And then based on that, the outcomes of the life cycle assessment are then communicated through an EPD, the Environmental Product Declaration, which becomes, oftentimes you'll hear it being referred to as a nutrition label for construction materials or for a particular product. It's very similar to the idea. And right now, what we're doing is we're doing it from cradle to gate. They're also often referred to as business to consumer declarations, right? So if I'm a DOT or a city that is procuring a construction material, I'm either requiring or asking for these EPDs, because when I get my asphalt or my concrete or my steel, I can look at what the typical impact is for the materials that I'm procuring. It is important to also point out that you can have these EPDs as industry averages, although we're really moving towards product specific and facility specific. So if I have my asphalt plant right next to Stephen's asphalt plant, I can compete with him on reducing my environmental impacts by making my plant more energy efficient. And then what would happen is my product, following the same PCR that Stephen would follow, would have a lower global warming potential, and that arguably would give me an advantage in the marketplace. So that's the direction we're moving towards, product specific and facility specific EPDs. Now, the point of the slide is not to confuse you, but to give you a sense of what a typical system boundary for one of these products looks like, right? And so what you're seeing here is the asphalt industry PCR system boundary. So right at the what you're seeing at the end, like what comes out of this is 1 ton of asphalt mixture, and you see right on top the blue boxes that are white in color are the upstream data sets. Like I said, the fuels, the transportation, the electricity, and then after that you get into the red boxes, which are filled in, and these are the transportation, when the materials are being transported, and we are expecting our plants to capture those transportation distances. And then finally you get to the green stuff, which is what's happening within the plant. And all this data is actually being captured directly by the plant managers in the calculation of that life cycle assessment and the reporting of the EPD. So we often refer to everything out here that is filled in and not a white box or an unfilled box is basically what we refer to as foreground data that is directly observed. In the greenhouse gas protocol world, a lot of this is also referred to as scope 1 data. And then of course, the rest that is not filled in or is in white in color, the boxes, those are what we refer to as these upstream life cycle inventories, which we've tried our best to standardize and make available through the federal LCA Commons. And these life cycle, these data sets are available, they're free to use, and there is continuous work going on within federal agencies to update these. And I have to take my hats off to the federal LCA Commons. They're the most wonderful people to work with. And they've, for example, a great example is the US electricity baseline, which is consumption specific data out of the Department of Energy, the NETL group. And it's a very high quality data set. And indeed, I can very proudly say probably a few of its type in the world right now. So this is an extremely important asset. One thing you can ask here as well. So we have these PCRs, and so I've talked about the program operator. I've talked about, they decide the implementation plan. So right now we have program operators within for asphalt as well as concrete. We have PCR committees, and clearly these PCR committees are making a lot of decisions about the underlying models, the choice of data. And then we also have these reviewers, right? And the point of these 3 groups, right, the program operator, the independent PCR committee, and then finally independent reviewers, is to ensure that there is consistency for it within a particular product category. There is comparability of the products within that product category. So again, if I have a plant right next to Steven's plant, somebody buys a product from either of us, they would know that the GWPs reported can be compared to each other. And then finally, we ensure that through the review process that what we're reporting is actually reliable, that we're not just making numbers up. And so in order to do that through the ACLCA, there has been a working group that's worked for the last 3 years, going on 4 years now, and published the ACLCA PCR guidance, process and methods toolkit. This is a live document, and there is a working group that continues to update this. And the whole point is to keep standardizing this process and make sure that there's consistency and reliability to the PCRs as well as the EPDs that we're getting. Okay, so that's a lot of information there, but where is EPDs in procurement policy right now, right? And this has been actually the really exciting part in the last 2 to 3 years, and there's been a lot of work here. I do want to point out that I borrowed these slides from my colleagues at FHWA, and Migdalia Carrion, the Sustainable Payments Program Manager. She helped me with some of these slides. So sustainability initiatives in the spotlight. First is beginning of last year, there was the Executive Order 1457, which called out net zero goals within federal procurement. Again, very important document that's driven various initiatives. Climate challenge, this is very specific to FHWA and our group, and I'll come and talk about it, but what this is doing is it's taking EPDs out into practice within the procurement world and working with state DOTs. We have 25 states and 2 local agencies participating in this, $7.1 million. Of course, there is the $2 billion through IRA for low carbon transportation material grants, and this has garnered quite a lot of attention. And then also the Everyday Counts program with Federal Highways, EDC 7. Part of that, one of the programs is EPDs for sustainable project delivery. And I've been involved both with the Climate Challenge program and the EDC 7 program on the technical side. The White House Bike Lane Task Force, their first set of recommendations was to use the priority materials identified were asphalt, concrete, flat glass, and steel. Again, these are high impact products, and the reporting tool they recommended was EPDs. So the reason why we're focusing on EPDs is because this has been identified as an instrument to get information across. And this is directly aligned with the Inflation Reduction Act, which also mentioned EPDs. And if you see the programs out here, the section numbers are laid out here. For EPA, $250 million for EPD assistance. Again, IRA calls out environmental product declaration assistance. EPA has $100 million, so altogether $350 million for both of those for low embodied carbon labeling for construction materials. And then the GSA has $2.15 million for use of low carbon materials, as well as for this $2 billion through FHWA for low carbon transportation materials grants. So there is a lot of effort at building capacity so that industries can produce these EPDs. And hot off the press, as of this morning, and I know Jenny's in the room, so I will probably just show the slide and walk away, but we're very excited. EPA came out with its interim determination on use of EPDs, and this is, and there is the website link as well, but very exciting on how we're expecting to see EPDs being used. And also, I have to say, I'm very excited by the fairly ambitious goal on the thresholds and the metrics that have been set. And I'm sure Stacy will have some views on this shortly afterwards. GSA has already come out with their lower embodied carbon materials specs for concrete and asphalt, and both of these are mentioning tools based on life cycle assessment, as well as EPDs from specific EPD programs that I spoke about for asphalt and concrete. And then, of course, there is a DOT policy statement on bike initiative, and again, they're prioritizing 3 actions, one of them being the use of EPDs, which is what we're seeing in EDC 7, and also developing a long-term bike lane policy. Education and research continues to be very important work in this area. Primarily, I would say education as an idea of life cycle assessment, and EPDs are getting out there into our professionals and our practitioners. State level initiatives, and I have to be careful because we were corrected on this by EPA. These are state level initiatives in the world of transportation and DOTs. We're seeing bike lane initiatives. The green states are the ones where they already have legislated. California was first with the Buy Clean California policy. Colorado has followed suit, and Colorado, they're already collecting EPDs right now along with California on their projects. Oregon is right up there, and the states in blue are in some shape or form considering investing in doing research, looking at implementation of life cycle assessment and EPDs within their transportation procurement programs. Just a little bit about Climate Challenge. This is a program very close to my heart because what it does is it takes EPDs and LCA and takes it directly out into practice with our state DOTs. And initially when this program was launched earlier in 2022, we were expecting 5 to 7 states. We were expecting some of these states to show up and nobody else. Well, as it turned out, we ended up with 25 states presenting interest. And the beauty of this program is that the states are getting the money, but there are academics involved as well as there are industry practitioners involved. And so it's really bringing together of a concerted multi-pronged effort at implementing EPDs and life cycle assessment. This program has just started beginning of this year, so expect to see some interesting results as we see states playing out what the best way it is for them to use EPDs and life cycle assessment based methods in their procurement methods. Broader policy level in the vision moving forward is to really, we're also working with FAA as well as FRA, FAA, the Federal Aviation Administration, FRA, Federal Rail Administration. I'm a co-PI on the FRA project, where we're looking at how do we create, I pointed out about standardizing our data sets and continue to standardize our life cycle assessment methodologies across these agencies, and of course with GSA coming up with their specs as well, to tie it all into the same underlying data sets, repositories, and making more EPD data available so that there is a common and consistent use across. And with that, I'm going to pass it on to Stacy, but I do want to point out that there has been multiple people involved in this effort, and we have to work together on this to go far. Stacy, all yours.
Great. Stephen, do you want to pause for questions or wait till the end and do popcorn for both of us? Either way, it's just fine.
Stacy, let's just keep going at this point, because my guess is we'll have more questions than time. So.
Yep. Okay.
And
makes
are
sense.
you going to use slides or should we stop?
I am.
Okay.
Yep. Can you see my screen?
Great.
Okay.
Yep.
All right. So I'm going to just pick up where Amlan took off. It might be a little bit of repetition that I'll speed through. But I'm Stacy. I'm the Executive Director of Building Transparency, which is a nonprofit that is established in 2019 to actually take all of this embodied carbon emissions data, try to find a way to make it free and open access to the construction sector to really start to act on it. So our world is all about how we optimize EPDs, make them available, and then comply with the policies that are coming to fruition. I show this slide because it's a good cross-section of who's engaged with this with us. And it's also a good representation of what it takes to do this work and engage with life cycle assessment data. You have to have the owners, the procurers, whether that's private or public, on board to set the requirements around the data and how it's going to be used to set limits or thresholds or disclosures. You also have to have architects, engineers, and contractors that actually are the ones designing in the construction sector, designing the projects and specifying the products, and then procuring them, looking at cost and now GWP at the same time. And then you also need the manufacturers and industry organizations, those that have to create the data, who have to understand what EPDs are, understand life cycle assessment, and then invest in actually creating their EPDs, engage so that they can make sure that that's done well. And also that they're members when it comes to industry orgs like AISC or the CFFA for vinyl roofing and things, that they understand and have the opportunity to access life cycle assessment professionals to do all of this work according to all of those rules and standards that Amlan mentioned. So it takes all of us, just like he said. This is a slide I used to just kind of demonstrate that based on who's engaging. I just want to step back. There's a why we're talking about this in terms of construction products, and that's largely because of the impact they have globally on global emissions. So we now know that materials just used in buildings and construction are more than 10% of the global CO2 problem. So it's something that we have to focus on. We've looked at operational energy consumption for a long time, but this specification and procurement of products and how we make them is a very big part of the pie that we need to get to zero. And in a visual slide, this is how I talk about all the things that Amlan has in his slide about what's included in this embodied carbon bucket through life cycle assessment and EPDs. And it can be cradle to grave. It is in the kind of broad definition of embodied carbon, but it starts again with how we're extracting raw materials, transporting them to manufacturing facilities, how those manufacturing facilities are using energy and creating process emissions. That's the cradle to gate piece that we're getting sorted with EPDs. But for the sector, there's all sorts of other things that we look about: transportation costs from a manufacturer to a project site, type of installation equipment, how we dispose of those materials or replace them. So graphically, this is the way to kind of think about it if you want to put it in your heads. And then the other way to think about it is through the lens of manufacturing. So I like to show this manufacturing emissions breakdown too. If you just look at the manufacturing of cement, iron, and steel, which are the major things that we build big buildings and infrastructure projects with, they're 38% of total manufacturing emissions globally. So we need to be tackling those urgently, along with everything else that we make. And then again, the other reason this is coming to a head is we're now getting into all sorts of requirements in both the public realm and the private around carbon accounting. And this gets into more definitions of more things, but when we talk about carbon reporting, there's the different scopes. Scope 1 and 2 are the things that are kind of directly in your control that you own and operate. Scope 3 is really everything that you purchase or lease. And so these supply chain emissions, these embodied carbon emissions are in the Scope 3 bucket. And what's happened recently is a whole bunch of companies in the private sector have begun reporting these Scope 3 emissions. And what's come to the top of the table is that GHG protocol said they thought maybe Scope 3 was 79% of the total. You're looking at your owned emissions and your purchased emissions. But these companies are now doing this reporting and finding that those Scope 3 emissions of what they purchase are over 90% of their total bucket of emissions. So if they're committing to zero emissions and they're including all scopes, this is the one they've got to tackle and figure out. And that's really getting to this data that we need at the product level to make low carbon procurement choices. I'm just going to go to this slide. This is just an example of that for concrete and steel. This is concrete. The reason why we're tackling these cradle to gate emissions first, if you look at this, it's stacking them up for you. So the A1 to A3 blue are those cradle to gate emissions of making concrete at different strengths. All the other stages, transportation, installation, demolition, they do add up, but relatively speaking, the place where we have to reduce emissions the most is in how we make the stuff. So that's why cradle to gate is really where EPDs are consistently being pointed to, because they can give us that blue bar in the most specific way that we can get today. Again, same for steel. If you look at different steels, that blue bar of how we make steel is just obviously the biggest one against everything else. And then this is just my way to describe EPDs in a simple way for those of us who aren't life cycle assessment experts or practitioners. I started out as a construction sustainability director trying to tackle this data. So this is my simple explanation. It's like a nutrition label. So if you think about going down the cereal aisle when you're on a low carb diet and you're looking for that lower carbon box of cereal, you'll look at the carbs per serving size. If you're looking for a low carbon product, you use an EPD and you use that GWP per unit. So it's exactly the same thing you do. We want to put the whole industry on a low carbon diet and use EPDs to have this level of comparison of carbon per unit. And I believe we're at a tipping point. I'm going to go through some slides really fast about all the policies. Alman already mentioned them, but what we're seeing right now is just a huge uptick just in the past 3 to 5 years in understanding of this and the urgency of needing the data to actually make informed choices. So again, on the private side, I mentioned it, but all of these companies are setting zero carbon targets by 2030, 2040, 2050, including all of those supply chain emissions that are 90% of their problem. So they have to be figuring this out alongside public policy. So this is the Carbon Leadership Forum's map of all the policies around the globe tackling embodied carbon emissions, these supply chain emissions of construction. You can go to their website, carbonleadership.forum.org, and click on all of these things and actually read each policy and if it's implemented or in process. And And they're all doing the same thing. So the Buy Clean policy in California was the first one where they required EPDs for materials and set carbon intensity GWP limits that manufacturers now have to comply with. And there's a host of others. There's carbon certifications that are looking at this. There's LEED credits. And of course, the IRA, which is the place where the most funding now really ever is being put into the space of helping to produce EPDs, helping to set the standards for EPDs. And it's very exciting to see the EPA publish what they did today as the next step in really implementing this. The other one I just want to mention is this is happening not just here in the US at the federal level, it's happening at the global level too. There's a lot of work in Europe, and the United Nations is also looking at this through the Industrial Deep Decarbonization Initiative, where they're doing exactly what we're seeing. What I'm loving about all of this is there's harmonization around the approach. So start with the high impact materials, require environmental product declarations, and then set either thresholds or what the EPA is now looking at, and kind of quintiles where you can move from worst to best over time. So it's happening really everywhere. And then just one slide on really what this distills down to. Again, I try to make this easy for folks that aren't going to be able to keep all of those wonderful graphics that Amlan showed in their brains. When it comes to this policy, at least, there's really these 4 steps: require EPDs, set targets or limits or thresholds, require facility product specific declarations, find all the ones that comply, and then submit them at time of procurement so you can prove what you did and that you met the policy. The whole goal of this, of course, is if we start to set limits or thresholds or even low carbon programs where you can point downward, the idea is that manufacturing responds. They see a benefit to producing lower carbon products, or they're required to, and the emissions intensities of all of these things start to go down. And if that happens for a concrete plant that supplies to the federal government, that means that concrete plant supplies that same low carbon product to anyone else that wants their concretes in that market. So there's a ripple effect here if we do this well. So how do you interact with this data? I'm gonna do this quick. It's just, our job is to try to make this data easy to understand and find. So the thing that we do at Building Transparency is host a free tool that actually digitizes all of these EPDs into a database that allows sorting and filtering and limit setting and all of the things. So just quickly, I'm gonna go quickly here. What we have to do if you're thinking about interacting with the data is be able to find it. So how do we get to actual product specific data points for things like concrete and steel? So this is how EC3 has organized it. You're able to go in and see how many EPDs we have. As Amlan mentioned, for concretes, things like concretes, asphalt, steel, we're getting pretty good data. Asphalt's picking up now too. But with concretes, in many markets now, we have thousands of EPDs from each plant because they're digital. We're actually at over 100,000 concrete EPDs today. So it just continues to grow even from this screenshot. But we have them for all sorts of different products. EPDs exist for a lot of things. But you can go into EC3 if you want to use our tool and be able to get to the place where you can do that filtering and sorting to make comparisons. So for concrete, it's by strength and geography. You can then click on compare and actually see all of your suppliers of concrete mixes that meet those filters and how they are directionally doing in their carbon intensity per cubic yard of concrete. So this is how manufacturers can actually go in and see how they're doing against their competitors, but also how a procurement official or a specifier can start to directionally, look at those suppliers that are down at the bottom with their intensity bars. And then also at the product level, this is where if you have 3 mixes from 3 different suppliers that have been proposed on a project, you can look at those carbon intensity values next to each other. They're following the same product category rule. And if they disclose their specificity and start to say that, okay, I know that this mix is my lowest carbon option, this 212 kilogram mix, CO2 mix, I can pick that one and look at it next to the cost implications as well. The other way this data is used is at the building level. So if you think about aggregating data for something like concrete, steel, windows, you can take all this life cycle assessment data and do a building life cycle assessment where you're inputting all of the quantities of your project and looking at the carbon intensities of the products. So what that looks like is being able to select your products and then dig into that to understand. This is just an example. I kind of threw this in here, but when we talk about the specificity of the product EPD, there's language around manufacturer, facility, and supply chain specific. And we build that into EC3, and EPDs are likely going to start building that in to the rules around what's disclosed. And that just tells you how specific the data is. So you can dig into that and understand that you're looking at two things that are comparable. Anyhow, you can take your EPDs by quantities, and this is just getting to a realized value of carbon for your building now. And there's policies that are looking at it this way too, where they're setting limits. GSA has something out there where they're doing building level accounting to try to capture more than just maybe the concrete and steel. And then at procurement, the same thing. What you want is to be able to take your cost from your 3 suppliers and the carbon intensity of their proposed mixes and compare them. So within EC3, and this is what a lot of the general contractors are doing now with Excel spreadsheets as well. They're, I of course put all of the suppliers at the same cost at this point for this comparison, but you can start to look at the carbon and the cost. And if you know that one supplier is a little more expensive, but 20% lower carbon, you have that data to make an informed choice. We found directionally that most of the time, the low carbon bidder is the low cost bidder too, which is lucky and nice. And then just one fact on where we are, this tipping point I talked about. As this data is now being required and used in all these policies, what we've seen within the tool, because we can track it as we get more and more EPDs, is just the increase. This is what's happened in the past year when it comes to all the categories that we track in EC3 for product level EPDs. And we expect this is going to continue to just go up as we get more and more requirements around this. And the last thing is just a proof of that idea that if we do actually require this information and use product-specific EPDs during procurement, that we can reduce emissions. The private sector, Microsoft, Amazon, Skanska, and Washington State began to do this on a campus project about 3 years ago. The concrete suppliers responded, they got their EPDs, they competed on carbon and cost, and their entire emissions for their plants in the Seattle area went down by almost 20%. Based on that one project requiring them to do this. So that's really the power of using the data. We don't all have to be LCA experts. We need to know enough to be dangerous, but we need to know how to actually engage with this data and use it to make smart choices. This is just a website for our nonprofit. There's a ton of videos and resources about all sorts of this stuff, whether it's what an EPD is, how to get one, how to use our free tools. And then links to things like the policy information that I showed you. Oh, the last thing I was going to just pop up because it's timely with the EPA announcement is just a little graph of this quintile approach. So this is just, it's kind of an eye chart, but this is us looking at the global warming potential of 5,000 PSI concrete in North America, pulling all the data out of EC3 to get the range of really 0 to 100%. And then you can start to see if you set a threshold of the 80th percentile, the 60th, the 40th, and the 20th, how you'd be looking at the range there. So this is kind of mapping to some of the work that's happening on setting limits or thresholds in different ways. All right, I'll stop sharing and we can take questions.
So let me suggest that what we do at this point is either raise your hand electronically or drop questions into the chat as soon as you can. And my feeling is we should be a little bit flexible on the amount of remaining time on this, but I want to first and foremost say, more than anything else, that was outstanding content and it was incredibly helpful. And I thank both of you so very, very much. But since we don't have another question yet, I'm going to just try to bring you both back to our, I don't want to say parochial mandate, but I hear you speaking to the private companies. I hear you speaking to the industries. I hear you speaking to the states. And again, as we know, roads, highways, all that stuff is done at the state, local level, and it's driven down by grants. So there's this disconnect between government policy and where the work's being done. And it's true that GSA is pretty much the biggest purchaser of construction for the federal government. But for the other $500 billion a year we spend in federal procurement, how do we reach the procurement officials? And I love the point that you said at the end. The goal here is not to make procurement professionals LCA or LCCA specialists. It's to expand the concept of the acquisition workforce so that they're reaching out to get the expertise. But again, what I hear in terms of when I look at the federal procurement data spend, I'm thinking this is happening at the subcontract level, the material level, the component level, but I fear that we don't yet have the message for the federal procurement official, except at the high macro and policy level. So that's my starting point. But again, please, electronic hands up and questions in the chat box, and thanks so much.
So I'll start maybe. I think because we've done a lot of work with the private sector, I always try to make the analogy and see where the similarities are there. And although if you think of an Amazon or a Microsoft, they're also building all over the place and setting policy that has to be implemented at a local level. So there is a similarity there of these kind of large corporate buyers to a large federal procurement buyer like GSA. And the good thing is that the good and the complicated thing is that this all happens at the building or project level, typically in the construction sector. So if we're talking about construction, the requirements are part of a contract for a building that then go to the design team, the contractor, that they then implement as they purchase the goods for the project. And if contract requirements are consistent for a large procurer across all the buildings that they then build or infrastructure projects they then make, that's really the point that we need to hone in on the federal side is how we get that consistency, how the people that make the contracts and then require their teams to go execute them have the right language and understanding to then push it on to the people that actually are doing the costing and the procurement to meet the requirement. So for me, that's the pinch point.
I think that's very bang on target, Stacy. And I think a instance to look at right now is what's happening in Colorado, because they've just put that language out there, their special provisions language for their contracts, and they're requiring. It's kind of interesting. They're asking for it only for informational purposes, not yet for decision-making purposes, and so just gathering and benchmarking, and so that going from of course. And I think, Stephen, you touched on it. The importance of education is so important to get it out there. They don't have to become LC or LCCA experts, but they need to know language and understand at a high level what's happening, request it, and then start doing the benchmarks, which can then go into meeting some like the EPA criteria that was published this morning. If we don't have the benchmarks, we really don't know how to meet those criteria. And so that's the direction to move in.
Hey, David Wagner, can you articulate your comment a little bit? Because I like the fact that when we started with the LCA and the LCT, it was very much cradle to. So again, if you want to say a word about that, David.
Thank you very much. As someone who works for the voice of the recycling industry, this is a very near and dear to my heart about who gets to claim what benefits from what material, because, for instance, for certain materials, we're kind of twinned with another industry, is that we provide their input, but our input allows them to reduce their emissions. So who gets credit for the emission reduction? Is it the supplier to that, or is it the one whose emissions are actually reduced? It's a huge problem. It defies boundaries. I mean, it might be scope 3 from one perspective, but scope 1 for another perspective. Yep. So, it's refereeing those things. Who is going to be who's going to be the counter that is the referee that throws the flag and say, well, you can claim them, but you can't? Or how do you amicably split or divide credits or reductions? Right. And that might be party to party. It might be industry to industry. It might depend on how the regulations are written.
That's a great question, and I'm going to, Stacey, I'm going to jump in on this, but with I think where this is and what we've in the construction materials industry, we're seeing this all the time, because it's not just recycled materials, it's also when you have co-products coming out of a particular process. So, for example, asphalt binder comes out of petroleum refining, and then asphalt binder goes into our asphalt mixture. So when we had the asphalt PCR committee, asphalt binder played a very crucial role on that. And so I did the LCA for that back in 2015-16, and we didn't really have good asphalt binder data. So part of what that was to look at the asphalt binder industry and say, we need your data. And that kind of led them to go and do their LCA, which helped us. It was like, all boats kind of went up there because we got better data to use. And now we're moving towards more regionalized data with asphalt binder. With recycled materials, again, the same thing we see in concrete with fly ash and slag, especially slag, because that is an actual ongoing discussion on how we're looking at the impacts of how we're allocating, the technical term allocating, the impacts of slag coming out of, whether it's the aggregate industry, steel, coming out of the steel industry, going into aggregate, going into cement as a supplementary cementitious material, different kinds of slag. And that discussion is happening. Where all these issues are getting resolved is, again, at that point of consensus in the PCR committees. And so what I would say, and I say this to everybody, if you're really interested in having, in your case, your particular voice on a particular machine, jump onto a PCR committee, because program operators want more representation on PCR committees. The more representation there is on PCR committees, the more valid the PCR becomes, because that is where the discussion happens on, well, how are we allocating the impacts of, with asphalt binder, for example, we started doing an economic-based allocation. And then eventually, when the asphalt binder industry stepped in and they did their LCA, now we've adopted based on and it was a purely scientific-based allocation based on a thermodynamics model. And so that's what we're using now. So we kind of all got better. So, I mean, the best thing for you is to look at what your PCR committees are, step in on the PCR committees and participate there, because it's the consensus. The consensus is happening in the PCR committees.
And just to be clear, that get to your point of who's taking credit, where that credit is in that published EPD for the end product. Right. So the more specificity that we get in the product category rule about how that EPD for that end product talks about, demonstrates, discloses where they're getting their upstream products from, the specificity of that, that's where you get the credit, is becoming an input to that EPD, where you're saying, by using my recycled product, your emissions factor of your product is going down. So in terms of the market side of the credit, that's really how it works. On the scope 1, 2, 3, we do have cases where one company's scope 1, 2 emissions are another company's scope 3 emissions, because the maker of the product is reporting those in scope 1, 2, scope 1, and the purchaser of the product is accounting for it in scope 3. I don't necessarily know if that's a bad thing, as long as it's very clear that that's happening, because in both cases they're reporting what they're doing and trying to reduce, just in different buckets. So we can't aggregate those numbers. We'd be double counting to sum everything up, which we need to be reflective of. But I think as long as we're clear about what buckets people are putting things in, if they're all aiming towards 0 and disclosing it consistently, then I think it's okay. That's my own personal perspective. But
so, because you all made the mistake of not raising other electronic hands, I just have 2 more things I want you to both riff on before we wrap up today. First, if you get a second, just look at what I dropped into the chat. I'm trying to figure out how to package policy here. And maybe Jenny's going to help us here in just a moment with that. I see her hands finally up. But again, what we're trying to do is communicate in this federal space rather than just the push down policy to industry and states. But again, that's one. The other one is going back to where we started. The interesting thing is the federal acquisition workforce is actually introduced to LCA and LCCA early in their training, but it's not taken seriously. And as you may know, the Defense Department has their own little earned value system, which is all about, money versus time or progress versus time. But actually, Frank Kendall, the Secretary of the Air Force, when he was the head of defense acquisition, for a few years, he did performance assessments of the acquisition workforce. But they reported transactional data. And they showed time and time again that we measure what's easy to measure, not what matters. And so what I'm trying to figure out is how we imbue these concepts into thinking at the policy level. So again, going all the way back to where I started. For me, the 1102, the contracting officer, when the program manager says, I can't, like, let's take the post office. When they say, we can't afford to buy the electric vehicle, we have to buy the inefficient fossil fuel vehicle, we think that LCCA or TOC permits us to say, don't focus on the short-term purchase price, focus on purchase price, operation cost, maintenance cost, time value of money, to David's point, disposition, which can be a positive or negative number, and externalities, or what some people call effects. And that's a pretty powerful tool, and it doesn't require this level of analysis, but I'm just trying to figure out how to get to the systems level or macro thinking in the broader training context. So if you have any thoughts on that, I'd love to hear it, and then we'll turn to Jenny.
I would actually really want to hear from Jenny first, because I think she's got a lot of experience there. Stacey, I don't want to speak on your behalf, but I really want to hear from her.
No, this is the implementation part, which Jenny, I think you should speak to.
Yes.
Yeah, and this was well timed, and so I haven't been able to speak much about this because we were today, as of 11 a.m. when we made this public, is really kicking off our stakeholder engagement process for this work with low embodied greenhouse gas emissions and construction materials. And so, but I think it really sets this sector up well as far as federal procurement goes, because there's an allocation of over $4 billion split between GSA and highways, where they have to, that is only set aside for materials that are low embodied. And so there's, that helps get that system moving. And then we at EPA were tasked with a labeling program for low embodied construction materials. And we'll be working on developing that based on some feedback that we're getting from that work with GSA and highways. And then also an EPD grant program. And so really being able to build out that whole system and work with other federal agencies as well. So, I think that this really is a very exciting path forward, where there is funding to do this work. And we do have it coming from various angles that include really setting up that procurement system where it's required, and then moving towards using the same system in other parts of the government, and setting up for success in the private sector as well, sending that bigger market signal and availability and increased transparency. But so I did want to make a plug. I put links in the chat to the press release that we put out today announcing the stakeholder engagement. We have 3 webinars. We're opening for a docket for comment. So I know that quite a few of you on the call here are involved in this area. So looking forward to a lot of engagement moving forward. And please share in your networks the links that I shared. So thanks so much.
So thanks, Jenny. So Amlin, are we using that as a segue to dodge my questions and turn it all over to Luke, or did you all want to weigh in on that?
I mean, see, I think your question is just top of mind because it's the implementation side, right? That's what you're talking about. It's just the implementation side. And again, I think what we're seeing is if the easier we make this to fit into an existing process that they use, and by having this money we now have in the IRA to actually take away the cost concern for this first implementation and really prove the process, and probably in my mind prove that there isn't a lot of cost, that money's going to go a long way. I think I'm going to say that out loud, but I think we're at a point where the implementation part is what's being focused on, and we have the funding to do it right now, and enough people that know enough to be helpful in providing the recommendations that the EPA is looking for.
And if I just want to add, Richard brought up the Buy America requirements, and I think in terms of implementation, there are parallels there. So without going too far into that, I think what we're seeing with again, I'm going to bring up the Climate Challenge program because, as I said, it's very close to my heart. But what we're seeing with what DOTs are doing, and they're doing it within an environment where there is no in some cases there is, but in most of the cases there are no regulations. They have no requirements, so they can actually try out and really explore what works best for their industries, what capacities their industries have, and also understanding what is actually possible and what helps really further discussion on sustainability. And I think watching out those results is going to be very very helpful and useful for all of us.
And with Luke's indulgence, if we could, I'd love to hear from Anish, and then maybe we'll get Leslie in too, and then we'll make our transition. Go ahead, Anish.
Thanks. Yeah, just really quickly, I wanted to surface that in California, there are examples of public agencies using these standards and basically doing the data collection for the last 4 years through the Buy Clean California Act. So I can just do some digging, maybe put some names on our speaker list. I think that would be pretty useful if we can hear from folks from public agencies, and then maybe the UC system. I think I'd mentioned them before as good examples of folks who have pretty extensive sustainable purchasing requirements and have some lessons learned that they would potentially be able to share. So just wanted to respond to that, since you brought up this question about how you actually make this work in a public agency, Stephen.
Leslie?
Thanks. Apologies for the balky camera. Thank you. Both these presentations were extremely informative. I appreciate all the preparation that went into them. I just am a little bit curious in light of some of the anti-ESG pushback we're seeing at the state level, primarily with AGs and some comptrollers, if you're seeing any slowdown in terms of buy green, buy clean procurement policies. Some of the states that were outlined in the slide are states where at the state level, there's been some pushback, and I'm not trying to start a political discussion here at all. I'm just curious to what extent, since we are the policy subcommittee, those impacts are being felt in some of the procurement, especially for some of the larger infrastructure projects.
From what we've seen, the pushback gets larger when you start to try to compare between material categories, which is why Buy Clean, I think, is being successful, is because it's not saying, wood industry versus concrete industry emissions. It's concrete industry emissions, let's lower those. Wood industry emissions, let's lower those. So we've streamlined that a little bit, where they're working on their own sector versus worried about the one next to them, which is where a lot of the pushback could start to come in, I think, when it comes to this kind of carbon assessment at the product level.
Yeah, and on that note, again, I think there is, within the industries, concrete and asphalt, and Stacey will probably agree with me on this one, there has been a concerted effort within these industries to reduce emissions. They've invested in their programs. They've done all that. They're, quote unquote, in many ways, ready for Buy Clean. I think what happens is when you come to the contractors, and contractors looking at it, and so we're doing a lot of education, but contractors are looking at it and saying that we've never heard of this stuff, and now we have to do what, and how are we supposed to do this, and how are we supposed to meet this? So it's more a matter of how is this going to impact our business processes? The contracting industry has very slim profit margins, and that is so there is that concern. And so I think assuaging that concern is education, listening to them, understanding them, working with them, and really helping build capacity, which we see that there is money in IRA for, and really helping build capacity within these practitioner communities. When it comes to how this information is going to be used, I think there is also some concern that it's going to be used in ways where we're only looking at the embodied carbon component, and we're not looking at the impact of reducing that carbon on the life or the service life of the particular infrastructure. And that is definitely a concern. And this goes back to looking at the life cycle cost, right? So because if you're using a material that doesn't have a lot of virgin material in it, what that does is it could impact long-term performance of that material, which means now we're doing our maintenance cycles more often, and we're reconstructing our pavements more often, which in effect really defeats the purpose of sustainability, right? Because we do want longer service lives. So there is that sense that, well, especially as we're moving towards quote unquote low carbon, we have to be careful that the low doesn't go below a threshold where we're just using, where we're essentially cutting corners on the quality of the material. So that is also a concern. But again, this is where the life cycle thinking and the idea of looking at long-term performance, as well as the impact of the embodied carbon, because embodied carbon is important. Once it's emitted, it's gone. We can't do anything about it. But so we have to account for that, keeping an eye on long-term performance and what our requirements and our design requirements are, and making sure that we're meeting them. So I think that is also another point of what I would call concern, but not necessarily resistance. But it's definitely something that DOTs are definitely looking at very seriously and looking to work through.
Thank you.
I think we're at that point in the meeting where we stop. I don't want to say we stop learning, but now we turn to our assigned tasks. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Luke. Thanks.
Oh, goodness.
And again, thanks so much. Those were wonderful presentations, and we'll make sure the slides get posted in our folders. But again, thank you so much to both of you.
Yes, thank you very much, Stacy and Amon. That was fantastic. And thank you for that introduction, Steve. This is where the learning ends, I suppose. Appreciate that. So we are back to a discussion and hopefully a sign off on our mission statement. And I think we have two goals today: to get a final sign off on the mission statement and to kind of dig a little bit deeper into the priorities that have been identified. And figure out if we can come up with a cohesive narrative that will set some direction for us and help hopefully inform what will ultimately be the recommendations we're going to pursue and the next round of speakers that we are going to solicit to present to the committee. So we have before you what is and has been the final draft of the mission statement. It has not changed. We have not received any individual input since the course of our last two meetings. I have not had any suggestions from anybody on potential improvements. We have it before you, and we'd like to open it up if there has been any thinking on this, if anybody's woken up with a light bulb in the middle of the night, and had an aha moment on possible improvements. If not, we'd like to consider this a final draft, subject, of course, to any potential input that we come up with later on. But if we can move past this, or when we move past this, we'll focus on the priorities. So I see we do have Nigel's hand up. Nigel, what are you thinking?
Hi, and this is a mission statement, so I don't want to dig into the weeds too much because I think what you have is excellent. But as we go through the design and implementation of what we're doing, keep in mind that oftentimes streamlining the acquisition process often leaves a lot of entities behind, small, mid-size, your designated entity firms. So as we're going through this, let's just keep in mind that part of getting the best value for government also includes bringing along those small businesses and trying to find ways to keep them incorporated into the supply chain.
Yep, I totally agree. And I think we should all keep each other honest if our recommendations lead in a direction that would contradict that or present a problem for small businesses in any way. Any other final thoughts or additional thoughts, modifications? Antonio?
I don't think I really have any modifications, but when Nigel brought up what he did, it reminded me of part of the conversation in our last public meeting where it sounded like we were suggesting that the support and focus on some of the things related to small businesses might be too encompassing for the policy committee, and that maybe this might be something that rests at another part of our committee's work. And I wasn't sure exactly where that came from, but I want to go on record as saying that essentially adding on to what Nigel said in terms of the importance of making sure that we're encouraging innovation really from all sectors, that this can't be limited to, just the big boys, so to speak, but we have to make sure that the small businesses and those that are not necessarily always a part of these solutions are given ample opportunity. And so a lot of that's through the policy work. So in case I didn't hear that right, it's a chance to clear the air. But if we were thinking about that, then, I'd like to have a discussion around how we don't include a focus that includes small business in the policy section and then still expect small business to be successful in this process.
So as one of the people who was trying to work with the other committees on this issue, I mean, look, this to me is, and I don't mean to be overly Machiavellian, but my fear is as a small group, we can't do everything. And to the extent that we have 3 groups, and to the extent that it is a clear element of federal procurement policy that a fair proportion of government contracts go to small businesses, and we're literally talking about a quarter or more of all federal procurement money. The question is who takes primary responsibility for that? So I do not think that our suggestion, and I'll own the suggestion if that helps. My suggestion was not that we disregard small business policy, but given how pervasive it is in the conversations in the industry subcommittee, I fear that it will potentially overwhelm our efforts if we can't, to some extent, let go or cede the primary authority on those issues to the other subcommittee. Now, let's be clear. The same thing is true with regard to workforce. Everything that we do, Stacy gave us a good example, comes down to implementation. But at some level, we have to cede that to the workforce as well. So I think all we were trying to do was draw lines. But again, I'm just one voice on the committee.
Okay, I appreciate that too, Steve. Just the thinking for me is if policies matter so much, so if we in any way give the impression, intentional or not intentional, that small business policy doesn't have a place in the policy committee, then how does small business participate? And what is the message we're saying? Again, most likely inadvertently, but I didn't think we wanted to say that message.
Yeah, I don't think that's what we're saying. At least from my perspective, I think the way I see this is we are going to entertain and try to arrive at certain policy goals and recommendations. And small business and the effect on small business and the effect on industry, those are going to be considerations that we are going to take into account when we make our recommendations. So I think I consider that as a consideration and not necessarily a policy goal. We're going to come up with policy, and part of developing that policy, we will try to account for and take into account for the effect on small businesses. So I think they're two halves of the whole, but I'm not, I'm with Steve in that there is a heavy focus on this in the other committee. And so I think where we can find a synergy together is where we're going to, is going to be the goal ultimately on some of our policy recommendations. David, you got your hand up.
Yes, thank you. Thinking along these lines, I don't want to add more words to it, but I think maybe parenthetically we're thinking possibly that it's demand and utilization of goods and services, and then parenthetically from a broad cross-section of providers or because that's I think what we're really saying, even though it's not in there, is that we are looking to source these things from many different kinds of businesses or entities. I don't know that we need to say that, but that's kind of the subtext that I'm reading into this based on our conversation here. Whether we need to say that explicitly and add a few more words, which can be difficult to try to identify or at least point to the fact that we're thinking very broadly about from small businesses, disadvantaged, underserved businesses, that kind of thing. I don't know if there's a way to put that in 5 words or less, or however many words we would want to add to this.
And let me just say as an aside, in the plenary meeting, we had the committee chairs and we had the industry subcommittee there. And unfortunately, I don't think we have them with us today. But again, this is all about division of labor. But the question is, personally, I don't think it defeats us if we try to be more inclusive in the language. My primary concern here is, frankly, I'd rather not be talking about the mission statement for the next year. But again, if someone feels like we are shunting important issues, then I think as a group, we should be addressing them.
I like David's suggestion. I like it a lot. And I think it goes towards getting something that at least acknowledges that supply chain and that supplier diversity and resilience throughout the supply chain discussion that we've been having on the industry side, but making sure that if it's policy, then it's clearly important to the government, right? So that's going to be something that's going to be driving through. But we had 2 great presentations earlier today And I was thinking that there's not a lot of small businesses that participate in the manufacturing of steel, but there's a lot that participate in the recycling of steel and the collection and recycling of rebar and concrete. If as we're going through these policies and thinking about how to get more environmental sustainability in that supply chain, just thinking and making sure that it's a part of our thought process every time to incorporate these small businesses and a diverse, particularly regionally diverse and resilient supply chain. So again, so if something goes down in one part of the country, we have policies in place that allow us to quickly switch out to another part so we can consistently keep this industry growing.
Yeah. One thing I wanted to add real quickly here, I think a couple of you might be in the industry partners subcommittee. And so just want to say that this conversation has come up in the industry partnership subcommittee consistently. And there is definitely in the mission statement both and in what that subcommittee is starting to focus on, a very heavy focus on small business, underserved segments and whatnot. So just wanted to put that out there.
Yeah,
so if I may, definitely heavy emphasis. Yeah. If
I may jump in, I am a member of the industry partnership subcommittee, and it was raised yesterday, or we talked around the issue, if not directly on the issue. But I want to reflect on Professor Schooner because I think he's right. It may be that we kind of have a concerted policy between subcommittees, is that this one suggests a policy for them to do, and maybe the industry partnership says, and this is how you're going to do it, or how we recommend you do it. So it's going to be kind of a I hate to say it's kind of a joint, it's part one and part two of really the same policy stream of activity.
I agree. I think you're spot on that, David.
I just don't know how to do that exactly. I don't know whether joint things happen because it kind of defeats the purpose of subcommittees at some level, but just something for everyone to consider. Or considering.
And I know we have Troy with us today. I don't believe we have Cassius with us today. I think that Troy is on the phone, but I do think that ultimately at some point, maybe this is an issue for the plenary committee. But I guess the real question is, Nigel and Antonio, to the extent that you've brought it forward here today, I guess the real question is, are you uncomfortable going forward on this issue? Or would you rather that we table this and think through a way to be more inclusive on it so that you have a greater comfort level with it?
So I think I would like to see if there's a way that we could add, some brief word phraseology in here that just makes it clear that we're intentional around being able to help instigate very diverse geographic, small business wise and others suppliers who can participate and help us avoid some of the challenges that we experienced during the pandemic, with the whole COVID environment. So, and I was looking at whether or not that's adding something under, the first part of the sentence where we're talking about practices that encourage innovation from, a diverse, supplier base, or if there's a way to maybe put it on the front end where, again, we're not trying to add another whole sentence to this, but adding enough so that it's obvious that we're inclusive in this policy. I don't know if Nigel or others have thoughts.
So you think that encourage innovation from a diverse supplier base and streamline the, I'm comfortable with that.
I like that. I like that. And we can define diverse supplier base later. Like that, yeah. I think as a mission statement, I think that's enough of what we need to give us the flexibility to move forward.
And we're not.
And Luke, if you can include that language with a little bit of color emphasis or something, then we can draw everybody's attention to it and we'll probably push this off till next meeting then. But I mean, again, Jenny, did I see your hand up?
That was just a thumbs up.
Thumbs up, good. From a diverse. Okay, great. I think Boris is plugging that in. Good. Okay.
Thank you.
When I didn't get any better, it may have gotten better. So, are there any other proposed amendments, or can we move on to the prioritization exercise?
So,
I see it, David.
Actually, I think Kimberly, I'll defer to her. She hasn't spoken yet.
Yeah, sorry, and this is really quickly. I was just thinking, like, for this change that I think most of us are comfortable with, do we need to wait till the next meeting, or can we just move this forward so that we kind of nail down the mission statement?
I'll take that suggestion. Is there anyone who objects to us moving forward with this as our final, subject to later amendment, mission statement?
And I'm taking David's hand raised as a question pending as opposed to opposition. But if I'm reading that wrong, please let me know.
Hopefully this is a friendly opposition. It's not really opposition, it's just an alternative, because I'm not opposed to this at all. I'm just wondering whether the blue text is best after innovation or after the goods and services that will be provided by the diverse supplier base, whether that's even more inclusive or more broadly applicable, just because at least the way that I'm reading this, it's limited to innovation. And maybe we want it to be
I see some thumbs up there. I think yes. I'm getting multiple head nods and thumbs that, Boris, if you can move the blue phrase to after services, is that?
Yeah, that's basically what I'm saying, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, which section do you want to blue?
Just
I think between services and two.
Just move from a diverse supplier base to after the word services.
Yeah.
Okay. Got it.
Anybody else want to say Control X at this moment?
I think that makes a lot of sense. I think that is more inclusive. Any other final thoughts? David, is your hand up again?
Oh, no, I just forgot to lower it.
Okay, great. Okay, good. Going once, going twice. No objections. Let's accept it and move on. Great work, everybody. You know, just in hindsight, I got to say, working with this group, the diversity of thought and the different ideas that you guys brought to the table really made this much better. I mean, if Steve and I sat in a room and tried to come up with something, it would not have reflected the thought that this did. So I'm very glad that everybody participated and put their 2 cents in, because this really is it has gotten better with each evolution. Next. Okay, so I think what we've tried to do here with our proposed priorities and discussion is to go through the high level overview of kind of what we have come to, the exercise we went through, where things landed, and try to come up with a narrative and go through another Jamboard exercise. So if you folks aren't logged into your GSA Google accounts, I suggest you do so now. When we took a look at the Post-its and where they landed, we tried to come up with a framework for kind of what they represent. Some of those Post-its were not actionable recommendations. Some of them were more considerations, and some of them were more suggestions for due diligence that we might do to come to a recommendation. So what we've done here, and Boris, if you could go back one slide, is to take a look and try to put them into categories that fit within that framework. So if you look, we have for low-hanging fruit and quick wins, where we landed was under actionable items: leverage existing tools, review and recommend practice tools to facilitate and automate the workflow and incorporation of sustainability through advances such as chatbots and AI. Review and assess the application of EPEAT. Consider use of existing tools such as whole building LCA, which I think we're all experts on now, net zero EPDs, Energy Star, and rating systems to deliver sustainable procurement. And one I think I highlighted in blue here because it stood out a little bit as something different. Develop policies that involve assessment criteria that are applicable to the range of product categories so that progress can be measured over time. So these are all, I think, in our opinion, somewhat along the lines of actionable items that we could take or that we could undertake as a committee. We also had on Post-its two things we considered considerations: contribute to the broader agenda to drive public procurement continuity on emissions disclosure and reduction, and to consider the impact and cost of new policies pushing vendors out of business. Both of those, I think, are things we're probably going to take into account no matter what we do. And we should be taking into account no matter what we do. But we didn't necessarily see them as actionable recommendations. And due diligence, there was a Post-it that identified research industry best practices, interviews with corporate sustainability officers. I think we all agree the diversity of thought and speakers that we get, the better informed our recommendations will come. So I think this is probably an important bit of due diligence, no matter what we explore. So when we tried to weave together what were the common themes in the low-hanging fruit and quick wins, it was a little tough with all of this in front of us. So what we saw was kind of utilization of existing resources and tools, use of third-party certifications and ratings, and the development of policies related to assessment criteria and potentially selection process. This isn't a cohesive narrative. There isn't really a direction. And so we're going to kind of go through an exercise to hopefully get us a little further down the line. Next slide. We went through a similar exercise in anticipation of this meeting, breaking down the LEAP and the big picture priorities into the same kind of actionable, what is actionable, what are considerations, and what might be due diligence, kind of looking for a common theme that might emerge and give us some direction, since these were all Post-its submitted by the entire committee before, during, and after the start of this process. So I'll just leave these on the screen for a second. But the common theme that emerged in the LEAP, the big picture priorities, was really a broad policy framework for ambitious action and awareness of GHG reporting. So with these two exercises and trying to look for what we might be able to extract from the work that we've done already, we put together a Jamboard that we would like kind of everybody to participate in. Boris, are you able to pull up the Jamboard?
Yeah, sure.
And while we're doing that, could I just mention one thing that again, just in terms of clarification, there was a little bit of a side meeting recently to clarify some earlier discussions we had on this issue of greenhouse gas reporting. And we just want to, I think it's worth the group hearing the way we understand the box, because again, Boris and Stephanie frequently remind us about what we can and can't or shouldn't do. But I think it's important to keep in mind that as we talk about greenhouse gas reporting, we bear in the back of our mind that there is a proposed FAR rule out there on that. And it is not our mandate, nor are we to put GSA in a position to suggest that we are advocating for or against the rule. Okay, so I think that we constantly need to be reminded on that, because this is obviously a point of significant importance to GSA. As someone who thinks that we should keep this on our plate, however, I think one of the points keep in the back of your mind is the rule is out there. And if the rule is coming, the rule only works if people understand it. So awareness and utility is not intended to be advocacy. And we don't want to basically be suggesting that we are advocating for or against the rule. That may not feel like an important distinction, but our sense is it is a very important one to GSA, and we want to be cognizant of that. And maybe Boris and Stephanie want to say more about that or not.
I think you captured that pretty well, Steve. I think that is well said. I don't know, Stephanie, if you had anything else in there.
No, he got it. He got it.
Mm-hmm.
Boris, our Jamboard is in the public meetings 119-2023 drive. This isn't Oh, did you put this together?
That looks like the clean. Oh, there we go.
So there's a different one called Priority Focus in the share drive. I'm not sure if you guys can see it. Public Meetings 119. Yep, there it is.
And Jenny, did you want to say something while the Jamboard's coming up?
Hey, Jenny, go for it.
Sure. Just in the interest of time, I just wanted to offer. So at EPA, I oversee our EPP program, which is the recommended standards and eco labels. And so I'm I want to make sure that I want to be mindful of my role in that, I think being on the committee, but then also being someone who might be making recommendations back to myself and my team. But I think that looking through that and how not just the recommendations, but how those recommendations are then used by the rest of government is something interesting to think through. And I wanted to offer to have one of my team members, Jenna Larkin, just put this in the document, to have my team member, Jenna Larkin, speak at one of our future subcommittee meetings and give an overview of recommended eco labels and standards, and especially since we just announced that we'll be assessing additional eco labels under our new framework. So I think that would be good background for this group if we do decide to go forward with that. And she is available on February 16th, which is the meeting after. I guess Porter will be on the next meeting. So just wanted to offer that for ease of scheduling, if that works.
It's a great idea.
And I'm sorry, Jenny, I hate to pin you down this, but did you say that you put that in the document, or you're sharing that by email, or you're just doing that orally? I'm just trying to operationalize all that.
I put it in the document, the speaker's document, as the second bullet under Porter, and noted that she's available for February 16th. But I know sometimes the Google Drive wasn't updating right away before, but I think it says it was saved, so it should be okay. But I think that would be a good next step, just so everyone knows, how the program works and all of that for context.
Okay.
So,
I added the link to
I
added the link to the right document. So I see others are jumping in.
Okay, sorry. We seem to have created two versions of the same competing document here.
No worries.
Thank you for doing that, Boris. Yours was infinitely neater, but not as colorful as mine. So I think if you guys can, we'd like to see you put some Post-its in here and try to identify what we think is kind of the next step in this progression here. What are the actual problems we are trying to solve? And I think the industry partnerships went through a similar exercise yesterday. Laid out here are the kind of actionable recommendations that we came up with so far in orange, green, and red. And so we'd like to see you guys throw some Post-its on what you think the Post-its are, what you think the problems are we're trying to solve, and where they might land in relation to the concepts that we've already arrived at with those kind of broad stickies from the last exercise. We seem to be running out of time. So unfortunately, I'd say I would like to give you guys maybe 5 minutes to do this now, so that Steve and I have something to take a look at over the next 2 weeks to come back to you with hopefully a narrative that we can agree on. And to buy
us a few minutes while people can be adding to the Jamboard. On the agenda, I guess we're supposed to make sure we open it up for public comment at that point. I don't know that we have many people in here who are interested, but let's open that door for a moment while people are working the Jamboard.
Great idea, Steve. Can we do that, Boris?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we can totally do that. And for those of you who are on the Jamboard, if you remember how to drop stickies, you just go on the right side, or you can just double click on any of these and make copies of them. But you'll see the little sticky note up to the left side of your Jamboard, and then you can click and drag. You can also type up in the chat, you can just chat me directly and then I can put those in for you. It looks like we have a hand here, John Reeder. Yeah, go ahead, John.
Hey, John, you're on mute. Oh,
I'm sorry. Can you hear me?
We can.
Hello. Thank you for the chance to talk. My name is John Reeder with the Environmental Working Group and Advocacy Group, and we do information for consumers to protect themselves and their families from harmful toxics, and we also advocate for policies to protect the environment and human health. So we're a national environmental group, and we have been very interested for many years in the toxic called PFAS. I don't know if you've heard of PFAS. It's found in many common products. It's famous for being the main ingredient for Teflon and has been used for many, many years on a variety of products. The President's Executive Order 14057 specifically called out PFAS and directed agencies to steer procurement towards safer substitutes for PFAS-containing products. There wasn't that much specificity in the executive order, but that was one very specific element, and it was amplified in directives that came from the White House on the same day that the executive order was issued, which I think was in December 2021. So since that time, since our group has been working on PFAS, and that was in the order, we've been trying to advocate with GSA to find a way to move forward to help agencies avoid the procurement of products with PFAS. And one of the simplest ways, I think, there are many ideas here that are great, and I understand the focus on climate, of course, that's the issue of the day for all of us. But all of the tools that we're discussing are mostly about providing information to the federal procurement officers and hoping that they'll do the right thing and move their procurement toward sustainable purchases. But another way to tackle this problem is to move government-wide contracts away from unsustainable products. So in other words, especially on the multiple awards schedule, if GSA were to sign government-wide contracts that sort of phased out unsustainable products, and they were no longer on the multiple awards schedule, it would become easier and easier over time because agencies could simply purchase off of the schedule and they would automatically be complying with sustainability requirements. So this is a very short time to try to lay this all out, I understand, but I would like a chance to talk to the committee in a little more detail about approaching the problem that way and about that possible solution.
And again, let me just mention, particularly since time is short, and I think we mentioned this at the plenary meeting as well, that, and I believe, John, you were the primary author of the group letter, is that right?
Yes.
Yeah,
yep.
So the group letter was shared with us through GSA, and the group letter has been posted in the shared files, which it might make sense for everyone to review, and then we can talk about that in the future. Okay. Thanks.
Thank you, Stephen.
Thank you, John. Are there any other members of the public?
I see Jenny's hand up again.
I just wanted to respond briefly to John. So I did post a link to EPA's, we developed it with our EPP program with eco labels. We developed a little chart of how or whether and how our current recommended eco labels and standards address PFAS. And then we've convened some discussions with eco label and standard organizations on how they could do that or broaden those efforts. But I think that more work is definitely needed in the area. So I wanted to note that as well. Thanks.
Thank you, Jenny.
Thank you, Jenny.
I have a technical question. If we end the public meeting, does the jam board go to sleep, or can people continue to do that after we've stopped for the day?
Yeah, it continues on. It does not go to sleep. Yeah, the Jamboard will remain active for the members to go in and do some more work on it.
Let me go back. Let me go back to Luke's point. Please take the opportunity to weigh in. You know, as I said at the beginning, we did the best we could for the plenary meeting to try to speak for the group, but it's not really our job to speak for the group. You're on the committee to speak for yourselves. And so, again, spend some time with that and continue to populate the other databases. But at least from my perspective, before we wrap up, and there may be some other things too, but first, I think we should give ourselves a minor pat on the back for achieving a mission statement. And second, I cannot thank Anlin and Stacy enough for the substance, and we'll make sure we get those slides uploaded as well. But again, lots of work left to do, and thanks everybody. Back to you, Luke.
Yep, I appreciate that, and I think that's that I think is our big ask. The meeting may conclude, and maybe Steve wants to take us through what he sees our next steps. But since we have your attention and you're engaged, I encourage all of you to stick around and populate this with stickies. And over the course of the next 2 weeks, Steve and I will take another stab at trying to come up with something that can serve as a guiding light that incorporates all of the input that we're receiving here, so that we can present something to you that's a little more palatable than another whiteboard with stickies. But all of this, I think, is an evolution, just like the mission statement. So take your time. We'll have an opportunity at the next meeting to talk about it. But please, stick around if you can, and make sure that all of your input is reflected here, because we want to make sure when we do take this to the next step, we have everybody's opinion incorporated. Steve, do you want to go over what you think?
It just seems to me that we ought to the extent that she's here, I don't think Cassius is with us, but Troy, did you want to say anything before we wrapped?
Sure. Yeah, hi, thank you so much. Fantastic meeting. Alan and Stacy, the presentations were really amazing and very helpful. So thank you so much. Congrats on wrapping up the mission statement. I think the addition made was a good one. And I have been in the car, so I wasn't able to see the jam board, but I look forward to taking a look at it. And it sounds like this was a highly productive meeting, and I look forward to taking a look at the specific ideas.
So I'm more than willing to turn it back to Boris and Stephanie, unless anybody else has anything else they want to mention before we wrap up.
Well, not hearing any comments. So again, want to thank everyone. I was going to give it to you, Stephanie, in just a minute here. Also be mindful, Steve and Luke, we can do an admin meeting as well before the next. So that's a tool available. Anything we want to fine tune so that we can prepare for the next public meeting. So that's something. Be glad to chat with you both maybe next week and see if we can organize that. Do you think that would be helpful? And I think I'm just going to pass it back to Stephanie.
All right. This concludes the 4th Policy and Practice Subcommittee meeting. The next virtual meeting will be held on February 2nd between the hours of 3 and 5. We again would like to thank everyone for your engagement and involvement, and remind the public that they can submit comments at regulation.gov. This meeting is now adjourned. Thank you.